Hello and welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name is John Sinclair and my co-host Mark Palavestra.
Hi John. Today we've got Howard Gerwin from RKLAB, and Howard has an extensive background in engine technology and the different fuel types. So we have a detailed discussion and deep dive with Howard on the permutations and combinations, challenges and opportunities around the different fuel types.
Definitely a very complex environment, and to try and get a better understanding of some of those complexities, it's great to have a chance to speak to someone of Howard's experience to see exactly what's happening with the different types of fuel types. So well worth a listen. So let's jump into it.
If you like what you see and hear, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and follow us on LinkedIn.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Modera is a cloud-based, AI-powered CRM and retail platform aimed at digitizing the physical process of selling a car. The Modera platform sits between existing automotive dealer and OEM systems, providing car dealerships a quick and easy shift to digital ways of working, all done entirely digitally and with total ease.
Howard, thanks very much for joining us on the show. Great to have you on. Maybe just to kick things off, can you just tell us a little bit about where we're going in the future in terms of engines? And maybe to start at the beginning, can we talk a little bit about electric vehicles and where the future of electric is?
Ooh, that's a big place to start. What I've seen and what we hear in the industry is that obviously there's a lot of political pressure behind electric vehicles. There's a lot of and there's a lot of activity. I think all the automakers have got some sort of an electrical offering. Some of them are tackling it more aggressively than others. You know, there are companies, frankly, like Volkswagen, that had to basically promise a lot of electrification to sort of settle their emissions debt, for want of a better word, from the Dieselgate scandal of 5 years ago. So you're seeing a lot of pressure, a lot of interesting new vehicle concepts coming out, electric-based. But one of the things that's really kind of got me thinking about it is that electric isn't the answer for everything. I think in the passenger car market, you're seeing a lot of electrification. I think it makes sense. I was in the UK a few weeks ago, and I was visiting with a colleague of mine, and he has an electric Volvo. And an example in the UK, I think it makes a lot of sense. He lives on the south coast, maybe an hour from London. 2 or 3 hours of continuous driving in the UK with the heavy traffic and the road conditions there. You're ready for a break, and a half an hour break to recharge doesn't seem too bad after a 3-hour drive. And you know, he talks about where he goes with his car and his destinations and the distances, and there's plenty of opportunity to charge, and it makes a lot of sense. The climate is mild, doesn't get too cold, doesn't get too hot. You're using your electric battery to drive your car. You're not using it to run heating and air conditioning and to keep the battery warm. So it makes a lot of sense. I switch over I lived in a small town south of Chicago, about 120 miles south of Chicago. I had an electric car for a while. I couldn't make it to Chicago with my electric car. I don't know that it would have been possible. There was no good fast charging solution for the car I had. The range wasn't enough. Living out in the country where I did, it didn't make any sense. And I suspect and when it was cold, the range dropped by half because the car was spending all its energy to keep the battery warm, keep me warm. And it was fine for running around town, which is why I bought it, but it certainly wasn't going to be my only car answer. I was always going to have something else. You know, I fast forward a few years. Now I'm living in the city of Chicago. one of our cars is a plug-in hybrid. It goes about 20, 25 miles on electric before the engine kicks in. I'm working at home, especially through the pandemic. My wife works in a small office about 7-8 miles from here. The electric part, she never puts gas in the car. So I mean, there's options, and it really starts to depend. Even when it's cold, she doesn't use up the full battery charge to go to work and that. And so there's all these options, but I guess for me, it's sort of finding what's the right answer for where you are in the world. And it even gets a bit more deeply scientific. Where does your electricity come from? These sorts of things, these sorts of questions are really quite messy, and there aren't a lot of simple answers. Although oftentimes, obviously, we hear the politicians talk, we're going to electrify. But I don't know that that's the only answer. I don't know that that's the right answer. That's sort of the question that's really being posed out there. And it may be even more acute in the world of commercial vehicles than it is in the world of passenger cars.
So a question for me, Howard, is around then trucks. So you talk about it makes sense for cars and if you've got a climate, so you've got that battery consideration as far as temperature to maintain the battery's condition, but also the condition of the occupants in the vehicle and lifestyle. So when you get to a commercial application, it's probably less about lifestyle and more about what the goods do or what the item does for the goods. Can you tell us your thoughts about electric trucks?
I don't know. I guess I don't know about your conditions in Australia, but the pandemic in the US has seen a dramatic increase in the number of little white vans driving around the neighborhood. Actually, they're kind of like an aqua blue because that's what Amazon's color schema is, but they're everywhere. I think that's a world of electrification. I mean, they're running kind of fixed routes. They're running limited range, a lot of stop and go, not a lot of high speeds. Those sorts of trucks, it makes a lot of sense to electrify, maybe even in a city like Chicago where we have a lot of climate extremes. Probably, I assume you guys have a lot of similar types of delivery trucks running around your cities in Melbourne and in Sydney. And the same thing. It's perfect. It's a perfect world for that kind of vehicle. Maybe with a plug-in hybrid if you have long routes, but it seems to make sense. And I think you even see a lot of discussion. I know that the United States Postal Service did a big request for proposal on a new postal delivery vehicle for the cities. And it had to have, one of the options had to be electric powertrains. So I think there's something there. When you get out to the on-highway world, when you think about the big, what we call in the US, a Class 8, or I don't know what you guys call it there, the heavy growth, the HGVs in Europe, the story changes a lot. It starts with the fact that the batteries and the power density of the batteries just isn't there. I'm not sure when it will be there, but you're starting to have to spend a lot of weight in batteries to put in the energy to move the vehicle around. And the recharge times that even if you had, say, a 500-mile range, which might be enough in some parts of the world, how long does it take to recharge? Do you have to start thinking about battery swapping because the recharge times are too long? I mean, when you think about pouring diesel fuel or even gasoline into a vehicle, you can put a lot of range in a car very quickly or in a truck very quickly. They talk about hundreds of miles of range per minute of refueling. And even with the fastest chargers they have in the US, the Tesla supercharger system, you're talking about, 30 minutes to recharge 200, 250 miles. That starts to be, now you go to a truck where, you're looking at maybe needing 10 times as much energy, maybe 5 times as much energy. The recharge times just become untenable. And then the batteries are heavy compared to the amount of energy they carry compared to diesel fuel. You end up with a situation where it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so there are also people looking at alternatives that are trying to think about other ways to solve the problem because of that, because although there's a lot of talk about electrification, and electrification makes sense, again, in the city, in some markets, but not everywhere.
And what about school buses? I was keen to ask the question, like we've got trucks doing the deliveries for the Amazon goods and the online sale goods. So long haul, still very much diesel. But what about the school runs and the school buses?
Well, that one is in that space. I think it's more like an Amazon kind of a thing. They typically run fixed routes. Kind of where they're going to go, where they're going to be. The vehicles tend to be relatively light. They have some room in their weight scale to put on more battery mass. There is a lot of activity there. They're actually, where we live in Chicago, there was recently a big announcement that an electric bus company is opening up a school bus plant maybe 60 miles south of here because they see that there's a market for it on the school runs. What's kind of interesting about school buses is, again, they come back to a central depot during the day. So if they use up their charge in the morning, they have time to recharge during the day before they have to go out for the afternoon run. So that's a big deal. The other piece that somebody talked about, it actually ends up that you've got all this battery capability, and there's actually a lot of it, sort of like a next level thinking, is that all these batteries could be part of the power grid during off-peak hour, during some parts of the day when you wouldn't use all the power up, but it gives like surge capacity for the power grid. So they've been talking about that as well. Again, because it's something that runs sort of a fixed schedule, it knows where it's going to be. It knows when it's coming back. You've got a central base to recharge. It sits overnight every night. The school buses aren't going places at night. At least they're not supposed to be. It seems like a good application. I think it's more like the Amazon case, less like the over-the-road case.
And Howard, a question for me is your larger engines like marine, rail locomotives and that, is there scope for electric there?
Locomotives, I would put to one side because, in a lot of the world, they're electric. They're not battery electric. They're running off overhead wires, and it's not a mystery how to do it. It's been around a long time. I mean, there's 300 kilometer per hour locomotives running all over Europe, pulling trains. Politically, infrastructure wise, power availability, that becomes more of the challenge. Economics. I personally wonder why we don't talk more in the US and probably Australia as well about electrifying long-haul locomotives, because we know how to do it. It's not a lot of mystery. And frankly, even the locomotives that are already out there today are already electric. They're just diesel electric. And why couldn't they just be overhead wire electric, even parts of the route? It's sort of I don't know enough about the rail industry to speak to why they haven't talked about that. In the US, the companies that run the locomotives also own the rail. They own all the infrastructure. They're keeping their mouths very quiet about this space because I don't know that they want to be pressed into that. On the other hand, I wonder why we don't. We talk about marine. Marine is a whole other world. And I think the future for diesel and marine, I don't see an end to that. Even in many of the government studies that I've seen highlight that probably marine stays diesel, at least for a while. There have been people looking at other fuel solutions. Ethanol is one. Ethanol, methanol, burning an alcohol in a diesel engine is one alternative, although the fuel is clearly not as intrinsically safe as diesel fuel would be. A lot of issues there. Again, a lot comes down to where these alternatives come from and how they're made as to whether they're really a good idea or not.
Now, there's a lot of talk about hydrogen, and there seems to be some misunderstandings or misconceptions around hydrogen, a hydrogen fuel cell and hydrogen being burned in an ICE engine. Can you explain the hydrogen story, please?
I began my automotive career in about 1990, and at that time, fuel cells were said to be 15 years away from being ready for prime time, for ready to run, be a prime high volume market solution. So now it's 2021, 30 years have passed. Hydrogen fuel cells are still, or maybe now they're 14 years away and not 15. The fuel cell technology is well understood, and GM built fuel cell cars in the 50s and 60s. Sort of an offshoot of the space race, because that's really when the fuel cells came. So they've been around a long time. They require very few pure hydrogen. They're expensive to make. Hydrogen infrastructure is not readily available. The hydrogen has to come from something. Right now, it mostly comes from natural gas. So it's not clear to me that that's necessarily any better than just burning the natural gas in an engine. That's one of the things that has to really be understood. I mean, there are these massive models to try to understand, and the government labs in the US have produced these massive computer models that are trying to understand, what is the net impact of trying to do that. If you've got hydrogen, you can also burn it in an engine. A lot of engine manufacturers have played around with it. I know Mazda's messed around with it in their rotary engines for years and years and years. It's relatively straightforward to burn hydrogen in an engine. There are some material changes you have to make, some material compatibility. Hydrogen goes after some aspects of some of the metals in an engine, so you have to look at that. It's not impossible. When you run hydrogen through a fuel cell, though, It's more efficient. I think that's pretty clear. It also doesn't, because of the temperatures involved, it doesn't produce the NOx emissions, which are the precursor to smog. NOx is also a much more severe greenhouse gas than CO2. I want to say it's factors of 50 or 100 times worse. Having a fuel cell, you don't make NOx. But on the other hand, an IC engine, the NOx regulations have been driven down to such a point, and we know how to solve that problem using SCR. So it's one of those that I think it's coming. The question will be, where does the hydrogen come from? Will it come from natural gas? Will it come from renewable fuels as a way to store energy from renewable fuels? You've got wind turbines offshore. You've got a lot of extra power. You can break water down through electrolysis and crack it into hydrogen and oxygen and then store it that way. I mean, it's another way to produce it. But if it's not, you can also produce it, which gets people a little freaky, but you've got excess power coming off a nuclear plant. You can make hydrogen there as well. But they actually refer to that, I think, as pink hydrogen or something. They give it some, they don't want to call it green because it's not if you're a greenie, it's not, oh my God, nuclear is not a green technology, but it's no carbon. I mean, you've got excess electricity. You can make hydrogen as a way to store energy, and then you can use it in a fuel cell. You can use it in an engine. You can even burn it in you can even burn it, you burn it in an industrial furnace. I mean, it's there. It's just the question of where it comes from. If you're going to have to go through CNG, natural gas, or go through coal to get your hydrogen, then you've got to have something to do with the carbon dioxide, the carbon that results from that reaction. And I don't know that we've really figured out how to do that at commercial scale yet.
I think, Howard, can you tell us a little bit more about the CNG and the methane and how that actually works?
Engines have been running on natural gas. I mean, CNG, is compressed natural gas. Methane is just another word for it. It's the hydrocarbon. It's like it's of all the hydrocarbon fuels, it's the best one. It has the best ratio of hydrogens to carbons. It's 4-to-1. People have been burning natural gas and gaseous fuels in IC engines and in gas turbines for a really long time. It's clean. It has relatively, compared to other fuels you could burn, it has really good CO2 emissions because, again, the ratio of hydrogen to carbon is quite high. It's as high as you get until you get to pure hydrogen. There have been a lot of demonstrations in IC engines. I know that there are a lot of city buses running around parts of the United States and other parts of the world running some form of natural gas. There's also the ability in some, again, depending on what you're doing in agriculture, to capture. They talk about the emissions they joke a lot about emissions from cows, but they talk about capturing the methane from, if you've got a big dairy facility, a big cattle facility, you've got a lot of manure. The manure can be captured and digested in an anaerobic digester, and you make your own natural gas, methane, which you can then burn in an engine and make electric power. You have farmers doing that in many parts of the world. People have been looking at that really ever since they've been, pretty much anywhere where you see a flare gas tower, there's probably something you could burn through an engine instead. And it turns out that, again, methane as vented into the atmosphere is a very potent greenhouse gas, much, much worse than CO2. So if you're going to vent it anyway, you might as well burn it through an engine because it causes less harm if it's burned through an engine first than if you're just going to vent it. And I think from an HGV, from a heavy vehicle standpoint, I think it's one of the solutions people are looking at. Again, it sort of becomes a bit like electricity. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg because you need a refueling infrastructure for it. And if you're going to try to convert a fleet to run on natural gas, you need to have ways to refuel it. So I think for now, in the near term, again, it's much like the school bus discussion, in that it makes a lot of sense for a centrally fueled fleet running around a city. It may be a good interim step. The challenges are that you've got big, heavy tanks. You're running at 3,000 PSI pressure to have reasonable tank volume. So now those tanks are heavy. You've got to manage refilling them. You've got to have the right technologies and the fueling stations. Again, if you're a garbage truck fleet and you're coming back to the same place every day, you put that infrastructure in, that makes a lot of sense. Over the road, outside of the city, it's probably a little further out there. I think it's one of the ones that people are going to look at as an interim step because of the low carbon, but I don't know I'm not quite sure. Again, I think for me, the world is sort of this messy mix of all the technologies. We mentioned diesel, we mentioned electricity, we mentioned natural gas. It's really a messy mix. And because again, each of these seems to have a place, where I think we all grew up in a world where there were only two solutions, gasoline or diesel fuel. And as I look to the future, I look out 10 years, 15 years, I don't know that there's an answer. I think the answer really is very messily dependent on what you're doing, where you're doing it. It may be a matter of even like what's your national profile for how you make electricity, which is well beyond the scope of an automotive podcast. But, if your electricity comes from burning coal, I'm not sure, unless you have a way to do something with the carbon dioxide, the CO2 that comes out of burning coal, does it make sense to turn it to electricity to drive a vehicle? I'm not sure if it's all as efficient as it needs to be, the whole cycle, unless you can do something with the CO2 that you generate. So that it becomes, like I said, it becomes very messy.
That has been a debate for some time. I recall sitting at a government conference here. It was an amazing one 12 years ago, and a futurist opened the presentation. And he said, what's going to happen is, and this is really 12 years later, and not a lot has changed, mind you. He said that electrification's where it's going to be at. You'll be seen as a carbon pariah if you drive around in a V8 vehicle or a vehicle that emits high CO2. There's going to be developments where we're going to mine the sky for carbon. And if you can mine the sky for carbon, because it'll be financially viable to do so, there'll be ways to develop that technology. Is there a way to mine the sky for carbon? I'm keen to get your thoughts, Howard.
I'm not aware of it. I have done a little bit of reading about carbon sequestration. So, there are some technologies being developed to take the carbon dioxide out of the stack and pump it underground into like abandoned minings to unmine unrecoverable mining strata. Apparently at high pressure, it bonds into the ground and becomes like a carbonate. So you're able to push a lot of it. It costs energy to do it. I think all of the technology is under rapid development. I mean, pretty much anybody in the energy industry is looking at that they have to do it because of the value of, because of the cost of carbon. But mining it out of the sky, I don't know how to do that yet. What is interesting is in another sort of connected world, and this is why this, again, it comes back to this is all very messy system connection. Farmers are now around the world are now looking to get into the carbon markets because, as you probably know, there's a marketplace for carbon and for the ability to reduce. There's the carbon markets are starting to. Companies are having to pay to get rid of carbon, and farmers are looking at ways to cash in on that through changing farming practices. Using less fertilizer, which usually comes from some sort of carbon-based production to generate nitrogen. The ammonia fertilizers they use come from typically from natural gas. There's a lot of carbon dioxide generated on a farm if you're running equipment, running more tillage, more. And so they're really looking at what kind of regenerative farming technologies they can use to store more carbon in the soil. And there are companies out there that are trying to get into the business of helping farmers document what they've done, helping farmers do it, document it, and get paid for it. Because maybe it's not mining it out of the sky, but in fact, it's keeping it from getting into the sky, putting it into the ground. So there's like this whole marketplace for farmers to try to get their piece of the carbon pie.
Yeah, I think there's that whole regenerative type farming. It's a big growing sector of the market. Especially there's no tillage, there's, as you said, no fungicides, no herbicides, no fertilizers. And they're having quite good success with it in the US. So I've been reading a lot of documents on that and find it quite fascinating. Howard, can you tell us a little bit more about alcohol? How do you think where that sort of fits?
I don't know as much about Australia, but I do know that in the United States, 10% of almost every gallon of automotive gasoline is alcohol now, almost across. I think the blending mandate targets 10% across the country. It's very hard in the United States, especially in the Midwest where the corn is grown, to find gasoline in a station that doesn't have 10% alcohol. I mean, obviously the 10% can vary because the way they blend it, but the target is 10%. So you can put 10% alcohol in any gasoline engine and it runs just fine. There's been a push in the United States by I joke about them as the corn industrial complex. to try to push that to E15, 15% alcohol for the octane boost. They're trying to sell the octane boost and some bit of a tax incentive there. So you see that, I think that's sort of a given. That's sort of a standard. I think they've hit sort of a plateau, let's say, in terms of how much the market can actually absorb. So now you're looking at, there have always been, or there have been, not always, but there have been for 20 years, flexible fuel vehicles. I don't know, you probably not have that in Australia yet, that run E85, that can run up to 85% alcohol, 15% gasoline. That comes in, the 15% ends up being really important for cold starts in cold climates like Chicago. Brazil has already they offer a flex fuel. Most cars you can buy in Brazil now can run anything from 100% alcohol to 100% gasoline using sensing. Pretty straightforward again. It gets a little bit messy when you start talking about cold startability, and especially in temperatures below freezing, below 0 Celsius. It's hard to start a pure alcohol car when it gets too cold. It doesn't, the fuel doesn't readily evaporate. So that's on the one side. On the research and development side, you've got companies, and I'll give a shout out to one that I've talked to and worked with a little bit, a company called Clear Flame. They're actually looking at, can you burn alcohol in a diesel engine? Can you put it, and this has been something that engine manufacturers have been working on for a long time. In my first job at Caterpillar, they were trying to run, I want to say it was a garbage truck on methanol. And the technologies weren't there yet. They were using glow plugs to keep the engine hot and to keep it firing, and they're having to change glow plugs like every day. But they were learning a lot. So we fast forward, and this company, Clear Flame, and I know that there's some competitors out there that are looking at better controls, better materials that allow them to burn ethanol in a conventional diesel engine and achieve diesel levels of efficiency running on ethanol, which is really nice because ethanol's got very low carbon. It can be carbon negative. You come back to regenerative farming practice. If you have good farming practice, growing the grain or the sugar cane that runs it, that produces the alcohol, you can have, it can be very, very low carbon net cycle or even carbon negative. The challenge is that the company that I know about, to start up, they're still developing the technology. One of the things to consider is ethanol has about half of the energy content of diesel fuel. Even though your thermal efficiency may be high, you will need to run almost twice as many gallons of fuel per mile through the engine. You can refuel it fast. It refueled as fast as gasoline or diesel. You can run it basically through the same pipelines and trucking and infrastructure that we're all familiar with. So, I mean, it's not impossible. I think it's it becomes a piece of the solution. If you were going to go and tell me I needed a solution to go across the United States in a truck 10, 15 years from now, maybe ethanol is a better answer than some of the alternatives because it may be easier to infrastructure, maybe easier to refuel, and maybe more cost effective because the modifications to the diesel engine are not as extensive as some of the other solutions. You're not like putting a fuel cell in. You know, you need a fuel tank, you need some different things, but there's all stuff that we mostly know how to do. What we don't know how to do and what companies are trying to figure out is how to make it reliably ignite and burn in a diesel engine and drive. And I think there'll be some interesting stuff coming in the future on that. But again, I think it starts at the passenger car level. Alcohol is a great solution. And hell, it's a great racing fuel. It's a great racing fuel. I mean, they've been running race cars on it for years. They've been running any cars run methanol.
We had that fuel here 15 years ago as a flex fuel for General Motors, and also Chrysler had it in a number of vehicles. And it's interesting, it just never took off. It never took off to the point where it's abandoned. So we've had LPG, and that was abandoned. Diesel and E85 flex fuel and it made a lot of sense. There still are service stations around here that still sell it, but it's in very, very low numbers because the amount of models that were locally made here that could use it, because all the fuel systems had to be, you couldn't have certain aluminium components because it would corrode it. You couldn't run an engine with a carburetor, for example, the carburetor would disappear.
There are a lot of challenges. The technical challenges with those are I won't say that they're simple, but they're well understood. Those experiences, you're absolutely right. And I think they jumped into E85. I know in the United States, there was a loophole in the fuel economy standards that made E85 make a lot of sense for companies to do. I don't know how much E85 fueling actually happened. One of the sad parts as an engine guy is that they never really fully took advantage of E85 because they had to protect against somebody putting in regular gasoline. E85 gives you very, very high equivalent octane number. It gives you a lot of ability to turbocharge, to downsize, to take advantage of all the alcohol. But you couldn't do it because you didn't know for sure. You had to protect against somebody just putting in regular gasoline all the time. So it's been sort of it came out. I mean, and there's still, again, you find the 85 cars around the US as well. I think the station down near my house has the 85, although I've never actually seen anybody use that pump. There's a lot of these things that are out there and floating around. And then the question is, well, which ones will dominate? LPG, you mentioned, better than the natural gas in terms of density. When it was big, it was also good from an emission standpoint because the sealed fuel systems that go with having propane meant you had less evaporative emissions. It's a little denser. It was easier to find refueling infrastructure because a lot of people had propane barbecues. And, in rural America, I'm sure in rural Australia, a lot of people have propane delivered to their house for heating and for cooking. So there was something there. I don't know if it's really on the horizon. Once you're going to go to a gas fuel, natural gas, compressed natural gas, methane has a better carbon to hydrogen ratio, and that probably becomes the dominant because you've got to make it. You've got to make it out of something. You got to make the LPG out of something.
So, Howard, in terms of ammonia for marine engines, there's been some talk about ammonia for marine engines.
I don't really know much about it. I know you can burn it in an engine. It's got hydrogens. It's got NH3, so there's 3 hydrogens. But I don't know much more than that. I think it's given the right conditions, you can burn it in a diesel engine. The question always comes back to any of these fuels is where they come from. How do you make them? What's the infrastructure to deliver them? So one of the things, and this applies, I think, to hydrogen as well, is if you're able to make the fuel in such a way that the carbon produced in the creation of the fuel, the net carbon impact is less than burning diesel fuel would be, then they start to make sense. But if you're going to just burn natural gas to make ammonia, I'm not sure it does make sense. One of the things that maybe factors in here is that if you're making ammonia in a big industrial plant, you have the ability to, as you said, Mark, mine the carbon out of the exhaust of the factory and stick it into the ground. And if you can do that and do it economically, then maybe ammonia makes sense. But it's this. I don't know enough about all of the economic models and they talk about well to wheel or well to prop kind of efficiencies and how that all works to be able to say that these are all a good idea. I think I can imagine a world where they would work, but there are a lot of conditions that have to be met because, again, you have to make ammonia somehow. Ammonia is not like you can't just go dig it out of the ground. So if you're going to make it, how are you going to make it? What's the most efficient way to make it? What's it cost to produce? How much CO2 emissions does it cost? Does it create when you produce it? And what do you do with those CO2 emissions? And if you can answer all that, I mean, again, they talk about it for marine, I think, because it's a little bit safer than like a natural gas or hydrogen would be in a ship. I mean, with ships, I think they're worried about safety of life at sea and thinking through things like that. And again, people are really familiar with diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is relatively safe. They don't see a reason to stop. I mean, aviation is the same way. I've seen storyboards where they've talked about the world of vehicles, and they've said, well, you know what? Jet engines are still going to run jet fuel, which is essentially the same as diesel. It's a slightly different, more refined cut of diesel. Jet engines, because of the energy density inherent in a gallon of diesel fuel, they may run jet kerosene forever because nothing is better than that. They may use some biodiesel. They may use some renewable sources to supplement the drilled petrochemical, but they may just keep running that again because that's the best solution for that industry and the most efficient solution for that industry. Those are the sorts of things I think we're juggling right now.
And how did biodiesel? Do you think there's any scope for that?
So I think I would say 10 years ago, there was a lot of activity around what I would call and there still is, I think, a lot of activity around biodiesel. There's really two views toward biodiesel, and you need to be careful and keep them almost separate in your mind. One is there's a biodiesel that you hear about farmers making for themselves. A guy in his backyard using a converted hot water heater and a shower head and a bunch of chemicals can turn any kind of vegetable oil into something like diesel fuel. And sometimes that's referred to as something blank meth. It's like a methyl ester. It's a different, anyway, the chemical properties are similar to diesel fuel, and you can blend it in with diesel. You can run it in a diesel engine, but the more modern diesel engines with the super high pressure injectors can't tolerate 100% of it. People talk about running their old Volkswagen diesel on just the leftover French fry oil. And yeah, you could. In an old engine from the 1980s, you could probably do that. A modern diesel engine, you can't. I think a lot of diesel fuel in the world now, and I know in Europe you see a lot of blends, 5% to 20%, depending on the country and the location. They grow, I forget what the crop is. Is it rapeseed oil? That in like Western Europe, you see a lot of rapeseed oil into diesel. It works. Again, I think they blend anywhere from 5 to 20%. What is interesting is that as that's become important, and again, it goes down to the carbon balance, is now you're seeing a couple of companies that have developed a process. The most famous one is the Neste Oy Finnish company that basically can pre-treat the fatty, the oils, the vegetable oils, the fry oil, the French fry oil, all of those sorts of things can be processed and used as a feedstock into a conventional to produce what is really chemically identical to a modern diesel fuel. And so they talk about that. And so sometimes I think I sort of separate them in my mind as a biodiesel, which is this almost like, I won't say it's a homegrown process because people do it in big chemical plants as well, which produces a certain type of diesel fuel. And on the other hand, you've got this renewable fuel, which they call renewable diesel, which follows this they call it the Neste Oy Process. And that really is producing something that's indistinguishable from diesel fuel. It's really clean. It's about as clean and pure a diesel fuel feedstock as you can get. And that's, I think, the oil companies are looking to that. That requires much more. That's typically going to be connected to a major oil refinery. And although it's not sexy like making your own fuel in your backyard would be, I think it's probably more long-term likely to see. And really kind of any oily feedstock from any source can go into it, animal byproduct and lard and stuff like that, as well as vegetable oil. So that renewable fuel, biofuel, I think that again, it can become carbon negative depending on the processing. Certainly it's lower carbon than just burning pure petrochemical hydrocarbons out of the ground. I think I think it's a piece of the solution. I don't think there's enough waste oil in the world for it to be 100% of the solution. I guess that comes back to my thesis from the beginning, which is the solutions in the future is going to be messy. It's not going to be just sucking hydrocarbons out of the ground. It's going to be a bunch of stuff. And all of these things are going to have to play a role if we're going to have a reasonable climate future and reasonable transportation solutions.
No, it does. It just really makes sense, Howard. It's almost like, and you mentioned it earlier in the discussion, the political pressure. There is this gap between the political pressure and what it seemed to be green versus the reality of application. And we see it even here. The take-up for EVs is very low. We're at 1%. We'll probably get to 2% this year. We might even push to 3%, which will be fantastic. But still, that's only 30,000 cars out of a 1 million car market. It's not a lot of cars. And even if we jump to 10%, that will be fantastic. But that will still take us at least 5 years to get to 10%. And it will come. But still, end of the day, it's still only 10%. There is almost like this expectation that the way the industry is talking, or whether it's the industry or whether it's the motoring community that is saying or mandating that we must electrify, and that is it. There is no other consideration but electrification. However, when you listen to organisations like Toyota are not sprouting that at all, and they're the biggest manufacturer in the world alternating between Volkswagen, who ironically you talked about having this carbon debt that they need to make up for Dieselgate. So it's like they're sort of saying, well, hey, we're going to get some credits here because we did bad things then, so we're going to over-electrify our range. I don't know. It's something that, I've been around this industry a few years now, and I've worked with some amazing people at my time at General Motors. And those amazing minds never said once that electrification was the only answer. It's a big part of it, but it is very much horses for courses and applications. And even each country has a different. In France, it made sense. Nuclear power, very green. Well,
exactly.
Green,
Yep.
So therefore, electrification, yes, absolutely, embrace it and go at 1 million miles an hour. But the long haul things that you mentioned, the fact that long haul trucks, how do you deal with that? The little things, and we were involved with it. We're very similar to your country as far as not so much the north, but the south and the southwest, where we have deserts, we have heat, we have cold climates in the southwest here, or southeast here. So we do get snow in certain locations. So batteries are sensitive to temperature, as we know, and their state of charge depletes with high temperatures, but also low temperatures. So there's a lot of energy that will be used to maintain that battery temperature, but also we want to have our temperatures maintained with comfort, because we've taken it for granted that we push a button, we dial up a climate control number, and that's it.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
That miraculously gets maintained. But we also are very time poor, and therefore we can't afford to have a journey where, I forgot to plug my car in last night because my teenage daughter drove it to the shop and back and didn't plug it back in when she came back. And now I've got an early morning meeting to go to, and I don't know if I'm going to have enough charge to get to it. So all of these little things come into play that it's a lifestyle change, and there is no silver bullet.
I think that's the key message that I've taken away. I think before you came on, Mark, we were talking about, there was a commercial vehicle conference here in Chicago, and a close friend of mine was there. And while we were at the conference, he was occasionally sending me snapshots and slides and snippets. And the commercial vehicle manufacturers, I think, recognize, and I think this is the same thing you're saying about Toyota. BMW apparently is in the same boat, by the way. The answer cannot be all electrification. The answer, hybridization, I think, makes some sense. I think you're going to see in the world of cars in places like the US and places like Australia, I can imagine a world in which, like my wife's plug-in hybrid SUV, it runs a lot. It spends most of its time on electricity. But when we want to go out of town, take a trip, we run out of electricity 25 miles in. And, if we can find a place to plug in, great. If we can't, great. We just fill it up with gasoline and keep on going. And I think that those solutions are going to be part of the future as well. You mentioned horses for courses. You mentioned France. I think that's a great example. They've got a lot of low carbon energy. They've got a lot of nuclear power. Makes a lot of sense. You're going to burn coal, makes a little less sense. All of that, you have a lot of solar energy. If you have battery, you got a lot of extra solar, you can put in a car battery. It's great. You don't, you don't have it. What do you do? It is messy. California has a lot of proclamations. They've got a very mild climate. They've got some very unique air quality issues, including, some of the busiest ports in the world. They've got a lot of questions about environmental equity they talk about, and how to reduce the emissions burden on some of the poorest neighborhoods. So they've got unique things. They want to make different decisions based on their world. That has a disproportionate effect on Wyoming and Western Texas, where there isn't anybody. And I think that's a lot like Central Australia. There's a lot of miles and a lot of nothing, except, a few farms. So those answers are not the same. And the hard part is for regulators to think about it in this way that you mentioned. You mentioned horses for courses. I think that's exactly right. It's tough to get your head around. And if you're a regulator trying to make a single regulation, even, and I'll end up with this, is we talk about the well to wheels is a big thing people think about, is, what's the best way, if you're going to suck some hydrocarbon out of the ground, what's the best thing you can do with it to make useful work out of it at the best ratio of work to production of emissions. And the problem is that you can regulate a truck, but how can you regulate the whole process? How do you measure and regulate the whole process? I mean, the spreadsheets that I've seen to do that, I've got this spreadsheet with like 50 tabs from one of the national laboratories. It's available for free for anybody to download, but it's like, I can't make sense of it, you know. And I looked at it for a while, and my eyes started glazing over. It was just so dense because you've got to think about every step of the process. You know, when you make alcohol, where does it come from? What are the feedstocks? You know, in some parts of the world, they want to take coal and turn it to methanol and use that. Again, you got to figure out how are you going to manage all of that? What is the total life cycle? It's a messy. And it's hard for regulators to get their heads around is how do you regulate something like that? And so it's easy to say we're going to electrify, as we talked about. That by itself, it's not the answer. At least not in the world that people come to expect. So I had one little tidbit that I thought you guys might get a kick out of. I don't know if the numbers are exactly right, but riding a horse creates the equivalent carbon dioxide emissions of a car or a truck running 16 miles per gallon.
Wow.
So we think about, should we go back to horses? Well, that's a lot. You know, when was the last time you drove a 16 mile per gallon car if you were just driving a car, you know, by yourself? Unless you're driving a pickup truck or an HGV, you're going to get better than that. So a horse is 530 grams per mile CO2, which is about 16 miles per gallon.
That's an amazing number. 16 miles per gallon is actually 16 litres per 100 Ks. It actually works. That's the tipping point where both scales cross over.
But again, that's not a very good number. And, no. You know, so clearly if somebody tells you that they've got to go back, we're just going to ride horses, the answer is that's not any better. Horses
for courses, 16 miles per gallon. What's greener, your horse or your 68 Camaro? Because it's the same CO2 footprint.
I mean, and that's sort of people don't, again, it's like the understanding emotionally of the numbers is, I think, a lot of key to understanding the problem is, what's really the scale? How do you scale it? And I don't profess to know it all about this subject. I just know that it's messy.
The thing with electric engines too, which we haven't really even discussed today, is the mining of the rare earth metals that go into the batteries, the recycling of the batteries. So there's a lot of those aspects which also have a negative impact on the economy, depending on where they're getting mined from. Can we recycle that volume of batteries? If we have every car in the world coming back with electric battery, can we recycle those batteries? So as you say, it's quite messy. There's no clear solution.
Yeah, and it's interesting that countries are now juggling. If you think back, we're all old enough to remember a time when OPEC was all powerful and could control economies of the world just by turning the spigot on and off. New technologies have come along. Oil extraction has changed. Offshore in the North Sea, shale and hydrocracking in the U.S. OPEC's control of the world economy has changed. Who controls the future of the metals that go into a lithium-ion battery? I've seen things where in Canada they're trying to figure out they realize that they have reserves of some of these rare earth metals. How do they make a green commitment to mine them sustainably and without having the negative environmental impacts that are associated with large-scale mining? They're learning their lesson in mining oil shale and tar sands in the west of Canada. The same questions apply, I think, is how do you mine these in a green manner and a clean manner? What does recycling look like? Car batteries are interesting because it turns out that a car battery is not necessarily a bad size match for a household backup system or a household battery. You actually hear about some of the automakers have started thinking, well, what do we do when the car batteries come back? Because they're still pretty good. They're just not good enough to run a car anymore. So what do you do with them? Do you take them apart, break them down, and reuse the materials? Do you sell them into another application like a household battery module? I know Tesla's talked about that. I know BMW's talked about that. They talk about power boxes on your wall that give you a day or two of electricity, way to store your power from your solar cells, perhaps. Power you could take power overnight and use it during the day and take advantage of the cost differential. So there's people talking about stuff like that. But again, none of it is at a scale anything like the auto industry is today.
And the thing is, even if you repurpose it for a household, it will still only last another 10 or 15 years. So at the end of that, there's the recycling. It still has to come back to be recycled at some stage.
Yeah, and some of it is, I think, the game they talk about, kick the can, kick the can further down the road, and let somebody else figure that out. I think that's what people are thinking.
It is funny, actually, yes, and that you point that out, Howard and John. That's the kicking of the can down the road. The whole idea of the electrification is to solve the problem down the road, because it's all about climate change, and if we don't go electric, the problem will be here in 30, 40, 50 years' time in significant numbers with the raising of the temperature, water levels rising, all this sort of stuff. But no one seems to talk about in 30 years' time the electric car batteries that we sold in 2021. What is going to be happening with those in 2050 when we are carbon neutral? Where do those rare earth metals go, or what remains of those rare earth metals in those batteries?
I'm certain there will be research projects embarked on to figure out how to deal with that. That's a fair question. You don't want them in the landfills. I know that.
But especially in the volumes, because you could probably cater for some certain amount of volume. But when you look at every single passenger car in the world, the volumes are just huge. And if you have that number of batteries coming back each year, it's the same as tires. You have a similar problem with tires.
And only really in the last 10 years have they started to figure out what to do with tires, and not just burn them in a dump, not just have them accidentally catch on fire or serve as breeding grounds for mosquitoes. I mean, that's what has happened in the US. I think they're getting better at tires, and I suspect they'll get better at batteries. I just don't know what that pathway is yet. The other thing maybe that we didn't talk about, I would add one more, is the impact of fleet turnover. How many new cars are sold a year? You talk about, you get to 10%. That's a big number for any market, 10% electric. Assuming we have the ability to charge them and people want them and all of that. That's 10% of the new car market. How long does a car last in Australia? How long does a car last in the US? The fleet is quite old, and the fleet's not getting any younger.
10.4 years is the average age of the car on the road.
Yeah.
So they will last 20 years.
And the heavy goods vehicles, the straight trucks, the semi trucks, they last longer. They get rebuilt longer. And the more expensive and the more complex, you're talking about very conservative fleet managers, very conservative owner operators, the more tech you throw at them, the more risky new fangled inventions you give them, they're more reticent to adopt something new. You can go get a new transmission from Allison. You can go get a rebuilt engine from Cummins. You can get new axles from Dana. How do you balance the incentive to get somebody to change? And then the course is, even if they wanted to change, how many can you make a year? How many can you bring on? But 10% of new vehicle sales, how many years does that take before that is even a majority of the fleet in this country? And you can start to do the math, and it's not very fast. So what do you do in the meanwhile? How do you incentivize? So the other piece of it is, which we haven't talked about at all, is how do you incentivize behavior, to change behavior? How do you convince people to drive fewer miles, to drive more efficiently, to run heavy goods vehicles more efficiently? How do you that becomes a whole nother messy political and policy discussion that needs to be discussed. I mean, we had this discussion in the United States, in my part of the country, a couple of months ago. There's a nuclear power plant. I mean, where we live, I think our power is like 92% nuclear. This part of the country, the specific utility that serves Chicago, has a lot of nuclear power. And there's been the nuclear plant, one of the big nuclear plants, is old, and it needs a lot of money to continue it. But it's not seen as green. But if you think about a low carbon future, I'd much rather see a nuclear plant refurbished than see them put up a bunch of high efficiency modern natural gas turbines, because nuclear doesn't use any carbon. But it's kind of this emotional thing. It's a policy thing. Do we need to be looking to re-up all of these old nuclear plants that are around the world and make them cleaner, better, and safer and more efficient? Because the alternative, what's the policy alternative? Well, you go to the only thing that's there and as an alternative that's even halfway clean is natural gas. And that's not really the answer either. It's a messy future. It's not as simple and clean as maybe we would have thought 20 years ago. But it's also an exciting time to be involved in this space because there's a lot happening. The utility is basically holding a gun to the head of the state government. Well, we're going to close this plant down, and then you're not going to meet your carbon objectives. And the state government saying, we don't want to give you, you're a private utility, you're run by investors. Why are we giving you more money to keep this open? But what's the right answer? Free market alone isn't going to solve it, but I don't know that we know how to regulate it yet either.
No, it's good chat, Howard. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been my pleasure. This is a messy but fun topic.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Howard. We really enjoyed talking to you.
It is fun to talk about. I know that I've been joking with one of my friends that we should open up a think tank to dig into this stuff because it is so rich. The problem is we're both a bunch of old guys like me, and we really need a couple of younger folks that can understand all these computer models and actually answer the questions that we're posing. Because that's really the next step is to understand what are the real right answers and how do you turn them into policies. No, it's been fun. I enjoyed it. I'll have to think about it. Maybe we'll have an update on RKLAB to share with you guys in the future. We're back up and at it, running with an engineering firm helping us sort of get things up and running again after a bit of a downtime with COVID. We're encouraged by what we see, and hopefully there'll be some good stuff to share before too long. Thanks
for listening to our podcast today. Hopefully you got as much out of the discussion with Howard as we did. Some very interesting topics indeed on what is the silver bullet, if any. There's complexity and there's probably more questions than answers that have come out of this discussion. If you like what you've heard, please signal the bell below so that way you get advised of new updates. Subscribe to us on YouTube, on Spotify and iTunes. Follow us on LinkedIn and follow our website at autocurrents.com.
Thanks very much for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.